It's been a week of sharp rhetoric from the president, presidential candidates, and the people. President Trump's comments that certain congresswomen should, quote, go back to the crime-infested places from which they came have ignited a firestorm of criticism and debate. At a Trump rally in North Carolina, when Trump mentioned a Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, some in the crowd started chanting, quote, send her back. The president is now saying he disagreed with that chant. Here to discuss that and detail some policy plans this morning, former HUD Secretary Julian Castro.
Great to be with you.
We appreciate your time. So can the president credibly disagree with that chant now?
He can't. He's the one that provoked it. You saw the video that night at the rally. He waited 13 seconds. He basked in that chant before he started his speech back up, and then basically tried to say that he started very quickly. And this is classic Donald Trump. He provokes this kind of reaction and then he lies about it afterward. The most important thing here is, look, this is not who we should be as a country. Throughout the generations, there have been political leaders that beefed up their own career by dividing people along racial or ethnic or religious lines. You think about folks that used to say, go back to Africa, or the Irish need not apply, or go back to Mexico, or the Chinese are excluded, or the folks that were marching in Charlottesville a year or so ago saying that Jews will not replace us. But in every generation in our country, there have been those of different backgrounds that rose up against that kind of bigotry and hate, and leaders that built coalitions instead of dividing. For those of us who are running for president, the challenge is that we need to be coalition builders. We need to be uniters. His specialty in politics, his trick is division. What we need to do is actually unite, and that's what I've been trying to do out there.
Getting to that unity, if you're the president and we accept Democrats are saying this is racist and Republicans are not condemning what's going on as racist, how do you in good conscience then work with those Republicans once you're the president?
Well, I think you have to start by appealing to their constituents. You know, it's not surprising that politicians, some politicians don't have a spine at this point. Fortunately, politicians don't always reflect the heart of the people that they represent. And I believe, while I know, I'm not naive, I know that there are a lot of folks out there that may agree with the president, agree with that sentiment. I've gotten the emails, I've seen the tweets on Twitter that people send out. However, I think there are more people, even Republicans, that find that disgusting and don't want to have anything to do with that kind of rhetoric. So we need to appeal to them.
Have you ever personally faced that slur? Go back where you came from?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I mean, I've gotten that from the time that I was in city council to the time I was mayor in San Antonio, on the campaign trail. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a minority politician or office holder who hasn't gotten some form of that, wherever they're from. You get it in emails, you get it on Twitter, and when I started my career in public service in the early 2000s, people would still send letters every now and then that said that kind of thing. And obviously I'm down in Texas and I'm Mexican-American, so it's not surprising, people saying, go back to your country or go back to Mexico. That's why I think a lot of people can relate. But here's the thing, I mean, near the time that our country was founded, Germans were the subject of that kind of talk. Irish were the subject at one point of that kind of talk. So there are families in this country that have a history, that understand that we face these kinds of things for different people. And that's why I think that people understand that we need to build coalitions here and push back against it. We have a politician that in an unprecedented way for over the last 50 years has been the most successful politician based on racial priming, based on separating people along racial and ethnic lines. So it's up to us to bring people together instead of divide the way that he wants to.
There are a lot of people who are probably fed up with this, but not really saying anything. Is that essentially white privilege, to be able to detach yourself and say, oh, well, this too shall pass?
I mean, sure. I mean, there's some amount of privilege that people have. There are certainly people that are more impacted by this. What I keep thinking about are all of those children, let's say they wear hijab, who are sitting in elementary school classrooms in the United States, who are every bit as American as anybody else, But because the president is doing this, it gives those little children around them even more license to make them the other, to tell them to go back home. And the damage that that does to that child, and also the damage that that does to younger Americans by corrupting their hearts when it comes to people who are different from them. The beauty of this country has been that we've gotten better over the generations. So what gets to me the most is that this guy is corrupting the youngest generation of Americans to go backward instead of forward, because we had been moving forward, and he's taking us backward.
On immigration, you're proposing essentially to decriminalize immigration now. You're talking a lot about this section 1325, I think it is, of the Immigration Code, which makes it a misdemeanor to cross the border without papers. Would that not, though, if you change that, create a lot of incentive for people to come across the border?
Not at all. There would still be consequences, negative consequences for coming across the border. It would just be a civil action in civil court. In other words, somebody would still be subject to deportation. You just wouldn't have the misdemeanor attached to that. The reason that that's important is because this is a law that has existed since 1929, but until about 2004, it was not really charged as a crime. So that there should tell you that it wasn't essential to our law enforcement. This administration weaponized that section of the law to incarcerate migrant parents and separate them from their little children. I've said that we should get rid of that law because I don't want a future administration to weaponize it in the same way to separate little children from their migrant parents. And I believe that we can be just as effective with regard to immigration without that law. On top of that, I've actually proposed on immigration that we get to the root cause of this challenge, which is that we partner with the Central American countries that people are coming from so that people can find safety and opportunity at home instead of having to come to the United States. I mean, last month we had 104,000 people that came to our southern border, and this president has wasted 2.5 years without doing what he should have done in the first place, which was getting to the root cause of the issue. If I were president, on day one, on January 20th, 2021, I would immediately call the leaders of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador and say, look, let's work together so that people can find safety and opportunity in your country instead of having to come to the United States.
Under your plan, what about re-entry? If someone who is here without papers commits a crime, say a misdemeanor, and is deported, is their re-entry into the country, is that a crime?
Same thing. I mean, there's still consequences, but that would be in the civil courts, not criminal courts.
Let's shift to foreign policy quickly here. Iran. The U.S. just shot down a drone in the Strait of Hormuz. What's the next best step that this country can take to avoid conflict?
Well, my hope is that this administration can be effective at de-escalating these growing tensions with Iran. Remember, we're in this mess right now, this chaos, because this president came along and tore up the Iran nuclear agreement, even though both on our end and also our allies and adversaries around the world, they acknowledged that that was the strongest agreement that had ever been negotiated to make sure that a country did not get a nuclear weapon. And Iran was complying with that agreement, according to everybody, even our own intelligence sources. He tore that up and has caused this mess. I think now the best steps are to be able to de-escalate that, to work with our allies to put pressure on Iran to get back in compliance with that agreement, because now actually, after we said we weren't going to abide by it, they're out of compliance. They need to get back into compliance, and then we need to figure out a way to get back into compliance with that original agreement or effectively negotiate in short order a new agreement.
So an agreement, essentially, an Iran deal with Trump's name on it, that's okay with you as long as we get back to the policy?
I mean, what I want is I want something that's effective so that they don't get a nuclear weapon. He never should have torn up that agreement in the first place, but now that we're at where we're at, you know, you need to make sure that that they're not going to get a nuclear weapon.
As we wrap up here, you've got some momentum. How do you get from where you are to number one?
Just working hard, you know, getting out there and doing a lot of events here in New Hampshire, in Iowa, these early states. We're staffing up, of course. We're going to be putting more people on the ground, and our fundraising has picked up a lot. Media attention has picked up a lot, and so I want to make the most of it.
All right. Secretary Castro, thanks for your time on Close Up.
Good to be with you.
We appreciate it.